So ever since I was really little, I was very curious to know how our genetic traits or how our characteristics that we can see in our own body, how are these passed down from one generation to the next? Now this curiosity, as well as inspiring my career choice, led to me getting my genetic material, my information that's contained within each of my cells, decoded a number of years ago. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit today is what I found out from the results of this test about the mutations that have gone into making me who I am today. Now, if you look at a family gathering and look around the room, you can often see very good evidence for inherited characteristics among groups of people. So, for example, if I look at my mother's side of the family, I can see that an awful lot of them have very dark hair. And if I look at my dad's side of the family, I can see that an awful lot of them have curly hair. So maybe I shouldn't be surprised that here I am, the product of my two parents, I have dark curly hair. But can we measure how this trait is getting passed down to me from my parents? We've known for over 100 years that inherited characteristics are passed along through DNA, and that every single organism has within them their DNA code, their genetic material, that contains the information to make a banana, or a chimp, or a person. Now this genetic code is made up of just 4 building blocks. So there's 4 DNA molecules, A, C, G, and T, which contain all this information. But we don't just have 4 of them, we have billions of them, arranged in all particular orders. And these billions of DNA base pairs are arranged in such a way as to encode tens of thousands of genes. But the crucial thing is the order of how this code is arranged. And if we change the order at all, we change the meaning. And so it's these changes and these differences that cause the differences that we see in all life. So if I was to take any of your DNA here and compared you to a banana, you probably wouldn't be very similar. That wouldn't be surprising. You'd be a lot more similar to a chimpanzee's genetic material. And if I compared you to any other human being, I'd expect to find that about 99.9% of your DNA was identical. So this means that just 0.1% of DNA differences, or variation, accounts for all the genetic differences between you and every single other person on this planet. So we've got very good in the last number of years at being able to find out about these variations. And the most common form is called SNPs, so single nucleotide polymorphisms, but SNP sounds a lot better. And what a SNP actually is the changing of a single DNA molecule, a single letter in the code, to something else. But changing even one letter in the code at a particular point can have big effects. It can change the meaning encoded within the DNA, and it can lead to differences that we can actually see and measure. And as I was saying, we've now got very good at being able to identify these genetic variations, these mutations, and we're starting to understand how different mutations are actually having an effect on us. So, you know, this was my opportunity to better understand some of my genetic mutations, some of what causes me to look and be like who I am. And so what I did was I went to a personal genetics company. And so what I do is I send them a sample of my DNA, and they take it, they sequence it, so they work out the codes, and then they analyze this, and they make the results available to me through an online account. So that's the nitty-gritty, but what did I actually learn? Well, I've talked a little bit about physical appearance, so let's start with that. There's plenty of information in our DNA about our physical traits. Being able to find it out, that's a little bit more tricky. But certain characteristics we know quite a bit about. So for example, the color of our eyes is determined largely by how much of a particular pigment called melanin we have in our irises. So if you have an awful lot of the pigment in your iris, you're going to have brown eyes. And if you have very little pigment in your iris, then you have much lighter or blue eyes. And how much pigment you have in your iris is largely controlled by a genetic mutation at a single SNP. So a single base pair change can have huge effects. This means that if you have inherited 2 forms of the G base pair, so 2 G DNA molecules, so one from your mother and one from your father, remember, if you have 2 of these at this particular SNP, you have very little pigment in your eye, and therefore you're probably going to have blue eyes. However, if you've inherited 2 of the A forms of this mutation at the same site, you express a lot more pigment, and so you're probably going to have brown eyes. Now, I actually have hazel eyes, and so my genetic profile revealed that, yes, indeed, I've inherited 1 copy of the A nucleotide at this site from either my mother or my father, and then a G at the other site, again from the other parent. And so this means that I have an intermediate amount of pigment in my iris, and it probably explains why I have hazel eyes. In a very similar way, we can understand a bit about hair curl. And hair curl is actually determined by the shape of your hair follicle. And there are lots of things go into hair follicle, but one of them is a gene involved in how round the hair follicle is. And so this is now at a different SNP, but if you have 2 copies of the A DNA molecule, you probably make a very round hair follicle, and therefore you have straight hair. Or if, like me, you have 2 copies of the G base pair at this SNP, you have a much flatter, much more elongated hair follicle, and therefore you have curly hair. And so looking through my DNA, I can see lots of little bits of information which kind of makes sense to me when I look at who I am and what I look like. But I have to be honest, I've picked these particular examples because they're highly hereditable. So what this means is that the physical characteristic that we see is really quite tightly controlled by just 1 or 2 genes. But this really isn't normal. For most human traits, and certainly behaviors, what we see is actually the accumulation of many different genes and also environmental impact. And so there's a complex mix going into most kind of traits. Now, another readout from genetic profiling is information about your genetic ancestry. So my DNA was compared to that of populations from all across the world. Perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, I was found to be mostly described as being of Irish or British descent. So that means my ancestors were mostly Celtic, Saxon, or Vikings. What was a bit of a surprise was I also found in there some DNA that mapped onto Finnish populations. So this suggests that at some time in the last 1,000 years, I maybe had an ancestor who migrated out of Finland, made their way over to Ireland, and passed along their genetic material, which I now have in me today. Now, genetic ancestry can go even further back than that. Neanderthals are the closest evolutionary link to modern humans, but they went extinct about 30,000 years ago. Now, before they went extinct, modern humans and Neanderthals lived side by side in what would be today Europe or Western Asia. And for a long time, there's been discussion about whether or not these 2 species would have intermixed. Well, quite recently, DNA was isolated from the bones of Neanderthals. It was sequenced and compared to modern humans. And this revealed that there's traces of Neanderthal DNA in every modern human population outside of Africa. So when my DNA was compared to that of Neanderthal, how Neanderthal am I? Well, it turns out I'm about 2.5% Neanderthal. This is about average for a European, and you can maybe make your own assumptions about what this might mean about my characteristics or any of our characteristics. So on a more serious note, genetic mutations can often be associated with serious or have serious implications in terms of health risk or disease. And this is the kind of thing that people would mostly ask me about when I talk about my genetic profile. And very understandably, many people would be concerned about taking a test like this in case they found out something that might cause them to be worried or to have concern. And I think it's important to stress that tests like these are in no way diagnostic. They cannot tell you for the vast, vast majority of things that are likely to affect you in your life whether or not you're going to actually get a disease. So, for example, if I look at my genetic risk of the most common cause of death in the world, so that's coronary heart disease. So being the leading cause of death, it's been studied rather extensively, and many different genes have been, and mutations in many different genes have been associated with either increased or decreased risk of heart disease. Now, 15 of these genes were investigated in my test. What the results were sent back to me was that for some genes, I maybe have a slightly increased risk, so those will be the bars above the line, and for other mutations, they give me a slightly decreased risk of heart disease. But you look at this graph, and it doesn't really tell you very much. It doesn't impact on how I'm going to be aware of my disease risk. And in fact, we know that personal choice can have a really great impact in terms of health. And so let's compare something like that to our genetic risk. So for example, the American Heart Association states that smoking is associated with a 2-fold increased risk of developing heart disease. And so for this, as well as many other types of disease, personal choice and lifestyle choices can have a much greater disease risk than can our genetics. A potentially more useful aspect of health-associated gene traits are our ability to be able to respond to different drugs. And an example of this would be the blood-thinning drug warfarin. So warfarin is prescribed, or can be prescribed, to prevent against blood clots. But there's no one right dose for everybody. Everybody responds quite differently to the drug. And so usually it takes a couple of weeks of optimization to get the right dose for each person. And how we respond can depend on a number of factors, but one of them is our genetics. And in fact, there's 4 different SNPs, 4 different mutations that are known to have a really strong impact on how we're going to respond to this particular drug. And in fact, my genotyping revealed that I have quite an increased sensitivity to the drug warfarin. Now, I've never been given warfarin, but if at some point in the future I needed to be prescribed it, I would have a good idea from looking at my genetic profile that the amount that I should be prescribed would actually be lower than maybe expected. And so this kind of power is something that's only beginning to be understood. And when we look at it in terms of 10 or 20 years into the future, I can see really this type of part of the genetic information being really useful in terms of being able to develop personalized medicine and hopefully to better treat human disease. So I've been talking a lot about all these different mutations that go into me. So when I look at all my information that I receive from the genetic test as a whole, does this mean that I essentially have a blueprint for how to make another copy of me? Or more simply, am I just defined by my genes? And the fact of the matter is, we're absolutely not defined by our genes. We know this to be true because identical twins, who are genetic clones, are not identical people. Now, if we compare, for example, me and my imaginary twin over here, clearly she's different. She's got a different dress on. She looks a lot like me. Remember, she's going to have a lot of these same mutations linked to eye color and hair and things like that. But she will probably have followed different interests throughout her life. She may not have gone into science. She may well have become an engineer or interpreter, dancer, or a myriad of different things, depending on what interested her at a different point in her life. Also, her health may be largely affected by her lifestyle choices or in her environment around her, if she was exposed to certain things. So just to sum up, I guess I'd like to say that personal genomics, at the minute, is something that's more of a curiosity, but it really does have the potential for improving human health and improving human response to different drugs. And really, I think it's something that we shouldn't be afraid of, but we should go into as informed as possible. Thank you.